Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that, might sound a little dry at first glance, RFP scoring. But I promise, if you stick with us, this is about way more than just spreadsheets. It's about picking the absolute best partner for your project. I mean, it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're building software, launching a marketing campaign, or even remodeling your kitchen. We're going to help you find the perfect fit.
That's right. We're diving deep into RFP scoring today. Really going to unpack it all for you. We'll be covering the what, the why, and most importantly, the how, because having a good scoring system can make or break your project.
Okay, so I think it's important to take a step back first. For anyone who's not, living and breathing business jargon every day, what exactly are we talking about when we say RFP?
RFP stands for Request for Proposal. Basically, it's a document that lays out everything you need for a specific project, and then you invite different vendors to submit proposals telling you how they would tackle that project.
Got it. So it's kind of like sending out a bat signal, but instead of, calling for Batman, you're calling for all the potential superheroes who could help with your project.
Yeah, exactly. And then RFP scoring is how you decide which superhero is the best fit for the job. It's a system for comparing all those vendors based on what matters most to you.
So it's not just about, going with the cheapest option.
Not always. Sometimes the cheapest option ends up costing you more in the long run. It's really about finding the vendor that offers the best value. That might mean paying a bit more for someone with, tons of experience and expertise, but sometimes cost is the most important factor.
Right. So you wouldn't just pick the cheapest surgeon for a complex medical procedure. You want to go with someone who has a proven track record. Someone who can handle anything that comes up, right?
Exactly. And that's where those different scoring methods come into play. We're going to unpack those for you today. There are so many approaches out there. Each one has its own strengths and weaknesses depending on your situation.
Okay, let's hear it. I'm excited to learn what's in this RFP scoring toolkit.
All right, we'll start with the basics. The basic method. All your criteria are weighted equally with this one. That works well for projects where all the factors are equally important.
So that's kind of like judging a chili cook-off where the only thing that matters is the spice level.
Exactly. Then you have the combination method. It's a little more complex. Each criteria gets a different scoring scale. It can get kind of tricky, though, especially when you're trying to compare apples to oranges.
I imagine you could end up with kind of a Franken scorecard with that method if you're not careful.
That's a great way to put it. Now, if you want a clear way to show what's most important, there's the distinct weightings method. You use the same scale for each criteria, but some criteria are just worth more points.
So it's like, okay, spice is important for this chili, but flavor and texture matter too.
Exactly. And then for those really complex projects, you've got the hierarchical method. This one's really granular. You actually group your criteria into categories and then subcategories.
Okay, so that one is starting to sound a bit like those multi-level marketing schemes, except instead of selling essential oils, you're evaluating vendors on like a microscopic level.
That's hilarious. Okay, now let's move on to some methods that are a little more specialized. There's the lowest cost compliant method. It's all about making sure the vendor meets your basic requirements. Then you just pick the cheapest one.
So it's like a game of musical chairs. But only the vendors who can actually dance make it to the end.
I like that. But I will say, you got to be careful with this method. If your minimum requirements aren't, thorough enough, you might end up with the cheapest option, but it might not actually be the best fit for your project.
Yeah, so when would that method not be a good idea?
Well, let's say you're building a website and your only requirement is that they know how to code in HTML. You might end up with a site that, just doesn't have all the bells and whistles you really need.
Yikes. So you really got to think about those must-haves before you start ruling anyone out. Okay, what else is in our toolkit?
All right, now this one kind of flips things around. It's the price cost per point method. You look at how good the vendor is first, and then you see how much they cost relative to that.
Ah, so it's kind of like saying, okay, show me what you've got, and then we can talk about the price tag.
Exactly. This one's great if you're willing to pay more for quality, but you still want to make sure you're getting good value for your money.
Makes sense. Okay, what about that best value method? That one sounds interesting.
With best value, the technical stuff matters most. Cost still matters, but it's not the most important thing. It's all about finding the vendor that's truly the best at what you need.
So I imagine this method is for folks who are willing to go all in on quality. But are there any downsides to using this method?
There are some things to watch out for, yeah. You don't want to overemphasize those technical aspects so much that you end up picking something way outside your budget. Or you might end up with a vendor who's amazing technically, but maybe they're not that easy to work with.
Right? Like the most technically brilliant surgeon in the world might be a nightmare to actually deal with.
Exactly. You have to figure out what matters most for your project. Do you absolutely have to stick to a specific budget? Or are you willing to spend a bit more to get the top experts? What are your non-negotiables? What are the nice-to-haves?
Hmm. So many things to think about. It sounds like RFP scoring is a lot more than just plugging numbers into a spreadsheet, huh?
For sure. It's about strategy, making decisions that help you reach your goals for the project and for your business.
Okay, so once you've figured out which scoring method you're going to use, what's next? How do you actually put this whole scoring system together?
Uh, that's where we move from the what to the how. We'll dive into all those juicy steps right after a quick break.
Okay, so we've talked about all the different scoring methods, kind of like our arsenal of tools. But how do we actually build the system itself? Like, how do we go from, a blank page to a fully functional scorecard?
It all starts with getting the right people in the room. Your stakeholders, these are the folks who really care about this project. The ones who are going to be affected by whatever vendor you choose.
So that could get a little messy, right? I mean, what if everybody has different priorities? Or even, like, conflicting opinions on what matters most?
Oh, yeah, that's definitely a possibility. Getting everyone on the same page, stakeholder alignment, that's super important. That's where good communication and facilitation skills really come in. You need to guide that conversation and, make sure everyone feels heard. And ultimately, you're trying to reach some kind of
'Cause
consensus.
it's less about just telling people what the criteria are. It's more about, working together to figure it out.
Exactly. And documentation is key here. Write down all the decisions, make sure everything's clear. That way, everyone's on the same page. And it's easier to justify your final decision later on.
Okay, so we've got our stakeholders aligned. Everyone's, vibing together. How do we turn those needs and priorities into something measurable? Like, how do we actually come up with the criteria?
Well, you start by figuring out what absolutely has to be there. What are those make or break features or services you can't live without? Those become your must-haves.
And then there's like the bonus features, right?
Yeah.
The nice to haves.
Yeah,
The things that would be awesome to have, but, not the end of the world if they're not there.
exactly. And honestly, those nice-to-haves, they can be a really good way to decide between vendors that are, pretty similar on the must-haves.
Ah. So it's like when you're trying to pick between two job candidates who both look great on paper, the one who has, extra language skills or volunteer experience might have a slight edge.
Yeah, perfect analogy. Our source material actually mentions a few categories to consider as you're coming up with those criteria. Things like features, implementation timeline, customer service, pricing.
Ah, yes, pricing. So we are considering costs, but it sounds like we're not letting it be the only deciding factor.
Right. And this is where that choice of scoring method really comes into play. If cost is the biggest concern, you might use something like lowest cost compliant or price cost per point. But if you're more focused on finding the vendor who's the most innovative or has the best expertise, you might lean more toward that best value method and not focus on cost as much.
Okay, so it's all starting to make sense. We've got our categories, we know our must-haves and nice-to-haves. What's next?
Now we got to figure out how important each criteria is. We give them weights or points. So basically, you're taking those gut feelings and turning them into a system that shows what matters most to you.
All right, time to put on our math hats.
Our source today actually gives an example of a scoring scale you can use. It goes from 5 points down to 1. 5 means the vendor, totally nailed it. 1 means they totally missed the mark.
So it's like rating a movie, 5 stars,
No.
instant classic, 1 star. You're wondering why you even wasted your time.
Exactly. But here's where we can get a little fancy. We can actually use something called an exponential scale for scoring.
An exponential scale. That sounds kind of scary, like something from a science fiction movie.
It's not that complicated, I promise. It just means that instead of each point being worth the same amount, the points become more valuable as you go higher. So imagine scoring customer service on a scale of 1, 5, 25, and 125. A little improvement in service early on makes a huge difference in the score. Really highlights the vendors who are going above and beyond.
Okay, I'm getting it. It's kind of like those video games where you level up. Each level is worth more than the one before.
That's it. It's all about showing those little but important differences between vendors, especially, when the scores are close.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got our criteria, our scoring system, our fancy exponential scale. I'm feeling pretty good about this.
Here's another tip from the pros. Keep that scorecard concise. The source material actually suggests limiting yourself to 5 suppliers max and no more than 20 questions.
Wait, so having fewer options actually leads to a better decision. Tell me more about this magic.
It's not magic, it's just about staying focused. When you have too many options, it's easy to get overwhelmed. And then you might miss those important details. But if you focus on just a few really good vendors, you can really give each one the attention they deserve.
So it's like wine tasting. If you try to taste like 20 different wines, you can't really appreciate any of them. But if you focus on just a few, you can really savor the nuances.
Exactly. It's quality over quantity. In wine tasting and in RFP scoring.
Okay, so we've put together our scorecard, we've looked at each vendor really carefully, and we've finally picked a winner. Is it time to celebrate?
Not so fast. Remember all that documentation we talked about? Well, now's the time to use it.
Right. We want to make sure everything's transparent and we can back up our decision. Plus, it's always good to learn from the process.
Exactly. If you document everything, it makes things more transparent and accountable. Plus, you can use that information to improve your scoring system for next time.
Like a debriefing after a mission. Figure out what went well, what we could do better next time.
I like that. You always want to improve your process, and RFP scoring is no different.
All right, so let's do a quick recap. RFP scoring isn't just about the numbers. It's about getting your team on the same page, knowing what you're looking for, and choosing the scoring method that makes the most sense for you. And don't forget to write everything down.
Well said. And remember, we've covered a lot, but there's always more to learn.
Ooh, which brings me to a question for our listeners. We talked about the criteria from our source today, but what are some of the things you look for when you're choosing a vendor? What are those, things that aren't always obvious right away?
That's a great question. Sometimes those less obvious things can be what makes the decision for you. Let's dive into those after a quick break.
Okay, so we're back, and I'm ready to dig into those less obvious things you mentioned, those intangible factors. What are some examples? Things that might make you go with one vendor even if they don't have the highest score.
Yeah, well, company culture is a big one. Do they seem like people you'd want to work with, day in and day out? Are they responsive? Are they good communicators?
So you're saying it's important to read between the lines a bit, get a sense of their personality as a company.
Exactly. You can usually pick up on that in their proposal, how they answer your questions, just the overall tone,
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if your team is really laid back and this vendor is super formal and corporate, it might not be a good fit.
Totally. And then you've got things like, how committed are they to sustainability, social responsibility? If those things are important to your company, you'll want to see that the vendor is on the same page.
So it's not just about what they can do for you, but, their impact on the world in general.
Exactly. And their reputation matters too, right? Have they worked on similar projects before? What are their past clients saying about them? Online reviews those can be really helpful.
It's like checking Yelp before you go to a restaurant. You want to know if other people had a good experience?
Exactly. And then sometimes, honestly, it just comes down to gut feeling. You might have 2 vendors with almost identical scores, but one just, I don't know, feels right. Don't ignore that.
Trust your instincts.
Yeah, trust your gut. You want to pick someone you can rely on, someone who you can work well with, even when things get tough.
Like picking a travel buddy.
Exactly. You want someone who's, up for an adventure and who you can still have fun with even when things go wrong.
Okay, I love that. It's all about finding that right partner.
Because RFP scoring, it's not just about finding a vendor. It's about finding someone who can help you make your vision a reality.
Well said. We've covered so much ground today. I mean, we really went deep on this one. From the basics of RFP scoring all the way to, trusting your intuition.
Yeah. And the cool thing is, it's a skill you can get better at over time. The more RFPs you work on, the easier it gets.
All right, so to everyone listening, next time you're facing a stack of proposals, take a deep breath. Think about everything we've talked about, those tangible and intangible things. And you'll find that perfect partner.
Because the right partner can make all the difference for your project and for your business.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of RFP scoring. We'll see you next time.